Today's lecture is an introduction to Korea. Korea is one of the most fascinating places in Eastern Asia right now. Its division into a North and South Korea is a remnant of the Cold War. Yet periodically, Korea threatens to explode into hot war once again, just as it did in the 1950s. In this lecture, we will explore some of the roots of this division. We also will seek to better understand the differences between North and South Korea. So let's get started. First of all, let's locate Korea on a map. The Korean peninsula is at the far eastern end of the Asian continent. It primarily borders China to the north, although it also has a very short land border with Russia. The border with China helps to explain Korean culture, which for most of its history has been greatly influenced by its much larger neighbor. As noted in the introduction to this presentation, Korea is divided into a northern and southern Korea. The border is roughly the 38th parallel. The capital of South Korea is Seoul, while the capital of the north is a city called Pyongyang. So, where have we encountered Korea thus far in this class? Well, let's start with the 20th century. Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910 and became a Japanese colony. Excuse me. It remained in Japanese hands until the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II. Like Germany in Europe, which was divided into zones of occupation by the Western nations and the Soviet Union, Korea was also divided. In this case, the Soviet Union occupied the northern half of the country, while the United States occupied the southern half. The division, as I said earlier, was at the 38th parallel. This line was never meant to be a permanent border. The plan was that after order had been restored to Korea, the people would unite and decide their future for themselves. Interestingly, the line dividing Korea really did divide Korea economically. The southern half of the peninsula included about 2/3 of Korea's population. Moreover, it included most of its light industry, and that means the manufacture of consumer goods, the things that people actually buy. It also includes the best agricultural lands, as well as the traditional Korean capital of Seoul. In contrast, the north, while slightly larger than the south, has about 1/3 of the population, and it's very mountainous. In other words, it doesn't have as much good farmland. It does, however, have extensive mineral wealth, and it had the bulk of Korea's hydroelectric power. Within a few years after the end of World War II and the division of Korea into a northern and southern part, the agreement to reunite the two Koreas into one was really exposed to be fiction. This became clear when Syngman Rhee was elected the first president of the Republic of Korea in 1948. The Republic of Korea refers to South Korea. Syngman Rhee, although he was an ally of the United States, was not a supporter of democracy. In 1948, shortly after taking office as president, he pushed through the National Security Law, which gave him broad dictatorial powers. He used the law to crush all opposition to his rule. Yet he also became a staunch ally of the United States. Why? Well, because he was virulently anti-communist, something that was important in the early years of the Cold War. In the north, Kim Il-sung was at the center of the government. Kim had been a guerrilla fighter, fighting the Japanese during their occupation of Korea. One of his new government's first acts was land reform. Like China, the landlords in North Korea lost their lands, which were given to poor peasants. The government also took over all industry. The government also from the start engaged in domestic spying. In other words, a secret police force was created to keep an eye on the people of North Korea. That's going to be something that will continue to plague North Korea to this day. On June 25, 1950, Kim decided to reunite the two Koreas at the barrel of a gun. With the support of the Soviet Union and Communist China, the North Korean army will overwhelm the forces of the ROK. Seoul was taken in 3 days, and the North Koreans continued to push south. The North Korean invasion immediately sparked concern in the United States. By 1950, the Cold War was raging. The Western nations, led by the U.S., had already fought off an attempt by the Soviet Union to drive them from the free city of West Berlin by airlifting supplies over the Soviet blockade that surrounded the city for more than a year. Thus, they argued that a similar effort had to be made to prevent South Korea from falling to communism. The idea behind the Western response was something called containment. According to the containment policy, the West would allow communism to dominate those areas that it already controlled, such as Eastern Europe, or, in this case, North Korea. However, it could not allow it to expand any further. In the case of Europe, that had meant preventing a communist takeover of West Berlin. In the case of Asia, that means preventing a communist takeover of South Korea. Thus, the U.S. will rush tens of thousands of troops to South Korea to try and halt the communist advance. But it wasn't just the U.S. that was fighting. 19 nations also took part in an effort that received the support of the United Nations. Some of the other nations included Australia, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Ethiopia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, the Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, Turkey, Denmark, India, Norway, Sweden, and Great Britain. Still, despite the support, the South Koreans and their allies continued to retreat. By August of 1950, the North Korean forces pushed the UN and South Korean troops into the southeastern corner of Korea, around the city of Busan. Meanwhile, to the north, they began to implement land reform, just as they had in North Korea. Land was taken from wealthy landlords and distributed to the poor. The war will turn in September of 1950, when the American general, Douglas MacArthur, launched a daring invasion behind North Korean lines at the port city of Incheon. The North Koreans were caught completely by surprise and were forced into a full retreat across the 38th parallel. This will create a dilemma for South Korea and its American allies. Should they stop at the 38th parallel, or should they push north to roll back the communist forces in North Korea as well? The Chinese and the Russians warned against such an action. Yet MacArthur saw his opportunity, and so he ordered American forces to continue north, and they began to approach the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and China. Excuse me. As they approached the Yalu River, the UN and South Korean troops were met by hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers from the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. The sheer number of the Chinese forces overwhelmed the Allies and pushed them back to the 38th parallel, where the war began to stagnate. At this point, the U.S. faced a dilemma. How could it win the war? How could it turn the tide against the united Chinese and North Korean forces? Some argued in favor of using Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the GMD, on Taiwan, to launch an invasion of mainland China. Remember, Chiang Kai-shek had been the leader of China until he was driven out by the communists in 1949. The thought was, unleashing Chiang Kai-shek on the mainland of China would distract the Chinese communists and possibly allow the Western countries to resume their push north. Others argued that rather than unleashing Chiang Kai-shek on the Chinese, what should be done is the United States should use its atomic bomb on both North Korea and even possibly the Chinese. This great weapon the argument was, this great weapon would convince both the North Koreans and the Chinese that they couldn't resist the Americans and that they should give up. Ultimately, neither strategy was attempted. Instead, a truce was reached on July 27, 1953, that reestablished the border between the two Koreas at the 38th parallel. The casualties in the Korean War were huge. As you can see here, South Korea suffered the most. Most of the war was fought on South Korean soil, after all, and so therefore, more than 373,000 civilians died or were injured in the Korean War, whereas almost 138,000 soldiers either were killed or injured. North Korea suffered casualties of about 215,000, although no one is exactly sure, because North Korea has been very secretive about releasing those results. Among the Americans, about 36,000 soldiers were either killed, or I'm sorry, I believe were killed in the Korean War. So for Americans, this was actually a pretty bloody conflict as well. The result of the division of Korea has been tragic in many respects. Two societies have developed on the Korean Peninsula. Northern Korea has become communist and totalitarian. In other words, excuse me, in other words, the people of North Korea have absolutely no freedom. They are completely under the oppressive rule of the Kim family, which continues to dominate North Korea. And we'll talk more about that in a future class. The South has developed a capitalist economy, and in the last 10 to 15 years has even developed a democracy. South Korea was largely a dictatorship for some time, but beginning in the 1990s and into the 21st century, South Korea has actually become a strong democracy. Meanwhile, the border between North and South Korea remains one of the most dangerous spots on Earth, as South Korean and U.S. forces work to prevent a second northern invasion. This border has been the site of numerous encounters over the years between South Koreans and North Koreans, most of them deadly. Luckily, to this point, none of them has led to a renewal of war. But nevertheless, both the South Koreans and the Americans remain on guard for a future possible North Korean invasion. That's it. We'll continue discussing Korea either online or in class. Thank you very much.